Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are here for my LEC Season Finals, Semifinals, and Finals analysis and overview video. Really excited to get into this. These are the final domestic games that I'm going to be covering in 2023. We have finally hit the end of the road here in the LEC. We will be getting, of course, the semifinals matchup and then the finals matchup to determine who is technically, I guess, the LEC champions of 2023. Obviously, all of these teams already confirming their spots at the World Championships this year by making the top three. They don't have to go through any sort of qualification system. This was the qualification system for them, and so not a ton to play for other than bragging rights and, I guess, a trophy at the end of all of this, but still a competition that I think everybody wants to win. I'm very excited to cover both of these series, but would love to know what you guys thought of them down in the comments section below. Who did you think was going to win in the semifinals, and did you think that either of them was going to be able to take on G2 once they got into the finals? Would love to know you guys' thoughts and opinions, of course, down below. But let's get right into it. Of course, if you are new here, what we're going to do in this video is go game by game in both of the series that we'll cover today, talking about the advantages and the disadvantages that each team was able to generate. I'll be giving a player of the game and a dud of the game for each individual game in the series, and at the end of each series, I will tie everything up with a player of the series. Of course, we'll talk a bit about Worlds at the end of this video because all three of these teams are heading to Worlds, and I'm really excited to cover that, but most of this video, at least here today, is going to be talking about these series. We'll save the Worlds coverage for a week or so from now when we start getting into that on this channel, but today it's all about finishing up and wrapping up the LEC in 2023. So let's kick off our semifinals coverage first and foremost right now. Very excited about this series. I think this is probably going to be the closer of the two series, or at least that's what I would predict going into this weekend. Of course, still a major arena, still a major stage for both of these teams, and both of them have absolutely earned it, taking very different routes to get here. Of course, I'm talking about Mad Lions taking on Fnatic. Really intriguing matchup on paper for me. I really do think this is a toss-up in terms of who is going to be able to take it, because Mad has consistently been able to defy expectations basically all year long. Nobody has really thought that they were going to be in this spot. They are your spring split champions. They made finals in winter as well. They went to MSI. Obviously, summer didn't go according to plan, but clearly they were just kind of, I don't want to say they were sandbagging, but clearly it was just a little bit of a blip in the road because they were able to take down Excel and make their way into the top three here in the season finale. It's going to be up to them to see if they can move on into that top two spot that I think a lot of people do kind of want to see them in, but they're very inconsistent. They looked pretty bad against G2, but basically everybody has looked bad against G2, so I'm not going to hold that against them too much. A couple of these players really need to step up. I think Elyoya is by far the biggest for Mad Lions. Razork is kind of the heart and soul of what Fnatic has been doing over the past few weeks, and I think if Elyoya can be the better jungler, which I do believe that he is, then I think Mad Lions could have a pretty good shot in this series. Of course, Niski, Hylissang, very, very big players. Chasey needs to start getting his best of 5 form back because he was certainly not there against G2. He got brutalized by Broken Blade, but for Fnatic on the other side, first of all, still Wunder in the top lane, still no Oscarinin. The surgery obviously is not, healed yet or completed yet, and so Wunder is still in the top lane for this team, and honestly, I think you could make a pretty strong argument that this is an upgrade for them. I think Wunder is a better player, and I think he showed that off against BDS in the previous series where he was really, really good, but of course, this team really does still thrive through their jungle position. Razork is so important towards what Fnatic wants to do. When he's on the champions that he's comfortable on, Ivern, Talia, Karthus, he looks a lot better than what he looks like on Sejuani and Maokai and a lot of these other junglers and, things that are a little bit more meta by a lot of other standards. And so it's going to be interesting to see if they continue to go to things that are a little bit more comfortable for them. Of course, Humanoid gotten better, gotten a little bit more consistent. He plays well when Razork plays well for the most part. Noah and Trimby are really solid. Fnatic is a really strong team, and I think a lot of people are picking them to win this series. I certainly am not out on Fnatic, but I picked Mad Lions to win this series because I do believe that Elyoya is the best player in the series. But if he is, if Razork ends up having a good series, and if you give Fnatic everything they want in draft, then that's going to be a pretty difficult series to win for Mad. But I'm interested to see how things turn out. Of course, going game by game means that we get to start it off with game number 1. And the winner of game number 1 was Fnatic, they are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, and this is exactly what I was talking about in terms of them basically getting everything that they wanted in a series like this. When you're talking about Fnatic, comfort really is the first thing that comes to mind in terms of how they have played over the last few weeks. When you look at how things went in the BDS series in particular, this Fnatic team looked a lot better when they started to get onto things that were a little bit less orthodox, if you will, a little bit more unorthodox, and I think that that continued here. Not to say that this draft is crazy, but Humanoid on the Taliyah, picking that early because it can be a flex pick between Razork and Humanoid, I think is a really good idea. And then, of course, if they're going to leave something like Ivern up, just go ahead and take that. Razork has really prioritized Ivern more so than a lot of other junglers. The LEC in general has prioritized Ivern more than other regions, and honestly, I'm very much here for it. I think Ivern is incredibly strong, and I think Fnatic continues to show that off, but having Ivern plus Taliyah gives you so much pressure in the early and the mid game. Pair that up with a roaming support or a support that can roam in Nautilus and an AD carry that you're happy to feed early and will be able to win in the 2v2 in Xayah, you're actually in a really good spot in terms of the draft. Now, that's not to say Mad Lions don't have outs. I think, again, if Elyoya is the best player in this game, it does become a little bit more difficult for Fnatic because Rel can start to do a whole lot, but that clearly was not the case. This was a pretty dominant win for Fnatic from very early on in the game, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me is going to go to Noah in the bot lane on the Xayah. Really good stuff. They continuously fed the Xayah, and by the time we hit the mid game, he was destroying and taking over every single fight that was going down on the Rift. And if your AD carry is going to be able to pop off and dominate like Noah was able to in this game, that's going to make it so much easier for Fnatic. Not that Noah has been bad by any means. He's been incredibly consistent, but I would argue that the best of 5 stage has been the weakest stage of his time in the LEC. Up until this point, he was really good in the regular season. It felt like he was an MVP candidate every single week during the regular season, the best of 1 stage, I should say, in summer. And then they got into the best of 3s, best of 5s, and he was still good. He just wasn't great. And I think that that was a little bit concerning. This is one of his better games in the last couple of months, in my opinion. Positioning-wise, he was basically perfect. He was very aggressive in terms of how he wanted to step up, but he's really allowed to do that. Outside of the Ahri charm, there's really not a lot of things that he has to be entirely scared of on the enemy team once he got super far ahead. He can just basically immune himself to Thresh Hook or to Rel engage if he needs to with the ultimate and play really aggro with that, and so I really like the way that he played this game, but I think the Xayah in general was a very good pick from the side of Fnatic. Of course, you do have to give a lot of credit to both Humanoid and Razork, specifically Humanoid in this game, number 1, because I do think that Taliyah was very active, moving around the map, was definitely more active than the Ahri. This is a matchup that we saw a ton in 2022, and so I'm sure both of these players are very familiar with it, but typically speaking, the Taliyah is going to be a little bit more active early on, where you're kind of hoping and praying that the Ahri can be a little bit more impactful in some of the skirmishes that you hit in the mid game, but it just didn't end up being the case for Niski. We'll talk about that in a bit, but Humanoid was fantastic. This was one of his better games in quite a while. He has stepped it up and gotten a lot more consistent ever since we got into the season finals as well. 20 assists for Razork is solid. Wunder was a rock on the top side. We'll talk about Chasey. He did not have a very good game. Wunder was very good. And Trimby was everything he needed to be to set up his AD carry. This really was a game where Taliyah and Ivern kind of ran the macro and they got the Xayah fed, and the Xayah completely took over, and then all of a sudden the game was over. It's exactly what you wanted to see from Fnatic. And then for Mad on the other side, again, a couple of bad things, really. There really isn't a lot of good things to talk about when it comes to this team in this game. I do think that they were active in trying to shut down Noah throughout the game, and they were able to get kills onto targets like the Ahri. But the problem with that is Niski didn't have a very good game. Like, his individual mechanics were pretty bad in this one, and so they couldn't actually capitalize on some of the gold that they were able to generate. I do think Carzzy was fine, but everybody else on this team was kind of meh. Dead of the game was really easy. That one's going to go to Chasey in the top lane. I don't know what Broken Blade did to him mentally, but that series completely drained Chasey. He got Cassante in this game number 1 and completely inted on it. Like, this was not a very good game from Chasey, and we've talked about it. He's not had good regular seasons, but he's always been able to step it up in best of 5s. It's kind of been the arc that he's gone on over the course of this year. Is his best of 1s were bad, his best of 5s were good, but now that we've hit the season finals, I mean, he got destroyed by Broken Blade. This game number 1 was pretty horrendous. I'm concerned about Chasey. If he's going to be this bad, that is not good for Mad. They really, really need him to step up, and at the very least, survive on the top side. Wunder's not the type of player that's going to completely obliterate you, because he's probably not going to get that kind of attention, but if you're going to lose as hard as he did, and if you're going to be as useless in team fights as Chasey was on a champion like Cassante, that's really, really bad. He was not good in this game. Like I said, Niski was also really poor, consistently looking for charms on the Taliyah. I don't really get the idea behind that. Maybe he knows better than I do, but I don't get it. Like, I don't get why you're not trying to charm Ivern, or why you're not trying to at least dive the backline, right? Like, to at least force Xayah to use one of her abilities to get out, or force some of the peel off, right? It just felt like he wasn't necessarily, he was taking the easy stuff instead of trying to look for the optimal plays. And when you're the one with the gold on the other side of the map, that's a problem. Like, you can't really get away with that. And so, wasn't super excited about Niski this game. We've talked about Rel in the past on this channel. If that champion gets behind, specifically in the jungle, she's basically a minion. There's really not a lot that Rel can do. The engage is obviously great, but if you full engage and your entire team can't kill anybody, then it's useless. There's really not a lot that you can do. There really is no other way other than just consistently trying to find picks in the late game that you're ever going to be able to be useful if you lose in the early game as Rel. Like I said, Carzzy was fine. Hilly kind of inted, but not in a way where it was really his fault. He was just playing really aggro, and nobody else could really, like, follow up on any of the plays that he was making. It's gonna happen with Hylissang, but overall, Mad did not look very good, in my opinion. And they're really going to have to change a lot of things going into game number 2. I think most of all, you just have to get better. If you're going to mechanically play like you did in this game, you're not going to win, no matter how the draft goes. But I do like Fnatic's draft. If they continue to get a lot of the things like the Ivern, like the Taliyah that they feel very comfortable on, I imagine that they are going to continue to win in this series. So a big adaptation game needed coming in from Mad Lions to not go down 0-2, which would be a death sentence. But are they going to be able to do it? Well, the winner of game number 2 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 2. They're going to go up in this series 2-0, and that's basically a death sentence. It's very difficult to come back from a 2-0 lead. It is very difficult to win 3 games in a row at this level against a team like Fnatic, who really is clicking on all cylinders. But if there is a takeaway, it's that, yes, Fnatic dominated this game, and they looked great, and everything good that you could possibly say about them is true. But again, Mad Lions just AFK gave them everything that they wanted in draft. And of course, they're going to do well if they get everything that they want in draft. Look at the bans coming out from Mad Lions. I'm going to complain about this really quickly, because honestly, in isolation, I don't hate this, but you're banning Maokai against Razork. Like, I don't know if they didn't do any research. Mac, generally speaking, is really good about this, at banning out champions that, you know, players have done really well on stage, but Fnatic is the one to ban out Ivern. That was left up by Mad Lions. That was completely left through draft. Fnatic was like, we don't want that. We're going to take Taliyah early on, and so we want to take that away, and Fnatic, or Mad Lions, have absolutely no desire to take away the Taliyah that has been almost unstoppable every single time Fnatic has played it. I don't know if I'm going crazy, but I would so much rather play against Maokai than Taliyah with Razork in the game. It just is what it is, but Fnatic looked good when they were given the things that they are good at. We'll go ahead and talk about it, but I'm just so confused by the strategy and the ideas that Mad Lions is using in this series up until this point. But let's talk about Fnatic first and foremost. Player of the game, no brainer, is going to go to Razork. He has done this basically every game that he has played Taliyah in the playoffs. This is so similar to what I believe is game 4 in the BDS series. It might have been game 3. I don't actually remember. It might have been game 5, honestly. I actually genuinely don't remember, but this is so similar to that game where Razork played Taliyah in the BDS series and just completely owned the map, completely took everything over. And he did it again here, and Humanoid's really good at Taliyah too. This just feels like such a priority to get rid of for Fnatic, but allowing it to get through is a major problem, and Razork made them pay. He dominated the early game. He got another gigantic lead. I believe Razork Flame Horizon Cheo in the previous series on Taliyah, and he almost did it again to Elyoya in this game. He's just so different on this champion. He's so much better than everybody else that he's playing against when he gets to play the champions that he's good at, the Taliyah, the Ivern, the Karthus, these things that he has obviously shown to be a lot more proficient at, that I'm just so confused that they continuously let it through, and it is what it is. But Razork's awesome, and like I talked about at the beginning of the series, I see a lot of people are very much like surprised that Razork is playing well. He's been really good in their best of 5s, in this season finals in particular. He was really good against Excel, he was really good against BDS, and he's really good right now against Mad Lions. It's basically everything you could have asked for. I talked about Elyoya needing to be the best player on the Rift in order for Mad to win, and that's because Razork is so important to get behind, because he's really good from ahead. He's really bad from behind, but he's really good from ahead. and that's what he was this game. Taliyah was basically an assassin, a beautiful game coming in from him. But the rest of the team was also great. I think Trimby in particular had a really good one on the Nautilus here in the support position. He's up and down, I'll say. The good games are really good, or at least they have been really good in the season finals. When he plays well, he really dominates the map. He's able to take over early and often, and he's able to move around. His mid games are better than basically anybody else in the entire league in terms of the pressure that he's able to apply to the enemy team, and he really doesn't allow, especially immobile enemy carries like a Varus, to be able to play the game at all. And we'll talk about that as we get into the Mad Lions section, but he can be a little bit up and down when he has to play from behind, as Fnatic is in general as a team. Luckily, both Razork and Trimby got super far ahead. Noah was super good again on the Xayah. He's very comfortable on this champion very clearly. Wunder was actually really good on the Sion. Again, it feels like he's integrated himself back into this team incredibly well. I think Wunder and Razork in particular had really nice chemistry in this game, which is something that we were saying the opposite of the last time these two were playing together. Humanoid was good on the Azir. Everything, again, kind of just went Fnatic's way, but I don't mean to say, like, how sustainable is it, but if they're going to get the champions that they like every game, of course they're going to do well. It's just crazy to me that they continue to get through draft, and it is what it is. But for Mad Lions, I don't know what else to say. It just feels like you didn't come into this series all that prepared, and I think it's really going to cost you. It feels like you're playing meta from like 3 weeks ago, pulling out Sejuani, Jace, and I don't hate either of these champions in the current meta. In fact, I like Sejuani a lot in the current meta. I like Rumble quite a bit in the meta. I like Braum quite a bit in the meta, but Jace and Varus are not the two carries that I would have went for here. An artillery comp into something that can be as active as Taliyah can be, it's just a very difficult comp to execute. You have a lot of ways to get onto the backline if you're Fnatic, and Mad couldn't really evade that at all, and by the time they hit like the mid to late game, they were already behind. And so this quote-unquote mid-game team that should be pushing lane, that should be dominating the mid-game, didn't really have the opportunity to do that, and there really was no coming back from it. I think Niski was probably the best player on Mad in this game. He was dealing quite a bit of damage, generating at least a little bit of gold. I see a lot of people complaining that he didn't really do anything, that, oh, when Niski is your top player, you're not going to win. I don't even necessarily think it was Niski's fault in this game. I actually think he was pretty good on the Jace. It's just not really much you can do on that champion when the entire enemy team is outscaling you. Carzzy was kind of bad on the Varus. His positioning was a little bit over-aggressive, but again, a lot of dive on the side of Fnatic, and so not a lot of ways to really deal with that. But really the player that I think got outclassed the most, in my opinion, was Elyoya in the jungle. This jungle matchup has been so Fnatic favored that it's almost impossible for Mad to win. I talked about that being the part of the map that Mad really needed to survive and stay alive in, and they just have not been able to do that at all. It's not been good for them. Chasey continues to be a negative on the top side. Hylissang really has not done anything this series except die, even if, his deaths aren't necessarily entirely his fault. Mad just looks hopeless, honestly. It feels like they have a bad game plan. They don't really know what to do against Fnatic, and they're also getting out-executed and out-mechanicked on the Rift. It just feels like they shouldn't really be in this series at all. This is the summer version of Mad Lions, the one that lost like 9 or 10 games in a row. They have come back in this series. They're going to need to figure it out. We know they can figure it out. We know they can be good. We saw what they could do just a couple of weeks ago against Excel. They took a game off of G2 just last weekend, and so there are some things that I think they can do to get back in this series, but Fnatic looks really superior at the moment. And again, if they continue to get things like the Taliyah, they're going to continue to win. It just has been how Fnatic is. But we'll go ahead and see if that continues to be the case. Of course, it is series and playoff point, I guess you could say, for Mad Lions here. They are on the brink of elimination, but can Fnatic close it out, or is Mad going to stay alive at the very least for one more game? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Mad Lions. They are going to take game number 3. They're going to stay alive in this series, which obviously is incredibly important. If they were to have lost this, they would be done here in the season finals. It would have been a clean sweep for Fnatic, and we would be moving on to our finals coverage. But Mad staying alive here in game number 3, and it was a really nice win. And ironically enough, it's Mad getting back to some of the things that they were most comfortable on that maybe aren't quite as meta for a lot of the rest of the league that ended up being really valuable. Now, it wasn't just that. We'll talk about some of just the outplays that Mad Lions had. A couple of these players really started to step up, and I think just in general, they felt a lot more comfortable and confident with this draft than they had with some of the previous ones. But getting that Kalista, getting something like the Maokai, leaving it on the board, realizing that Fnatic really doesn't prioritize that champion, and so not taking it away from yourself, essentially, and being able to pick it and dominate on it, like, these are the things that really are going to separate Mad and keep them alive in a series like this. It just felt like so much more got, revealed in this series, and a lot of the things that we kind of expected to see, we did end up seeing in this series when these things, or in this game, I should say, when things went a little bit of a different way. But let's go ahead and talk about it. For Mad, player of the game, really easy choice for me. Going to go to Hylissang in the support position on the Alistar. Great game from Hilly. We've kind of been waiting for him to really step up and kind of separate himself. Obviously, his score lines have been miserable through the first 2 games of this series, but I don't think anybody was really blaming him for any of the losses. He was just kind of, playing more engaged style tanks or Braum in the first 2 games that lost. When you're losing and you play those champions, your scoreline is going to look a lot worse. That's just going to be how it is. But he was allowed to be a lot more aggressive in this game. He had the Kalista where he could play aggro in the early game against something like the Ezreal, which obviously can be relatively safe. But, I mean, look at the rest of this team. There's nobody who's going to be able to punish any early aggression coming out from the side of Mad Lions, and Hilly knew that. And so he was able to kind of get the ball rolling. He was able to link up a lot with Elyoya on this Maokai, move around the map and create a lot of problems, start a lot of skirmishes, and really start to get this game out of control. By the time we hit the mid game, it really wasn't all that close. Now, obviously, a lot of these players did end up showing up a lot in the late game as well. It wasn't just an early mid game diff, but I think Hilly was probably the most consistent player across, all 26 minutes of this game, if you will. And I think Elyoya deserves a lot of credit for that as well. This is easily his best game of the series up until this point. Really, the only game where he's out jungled Razork on the other side of the map, and so this is exactly what we wanted to see from him. Him getting the Maokai, a champion that is ridiculously strong. Still the best engaged tank in the entire game. Mad had been the ones banning it out throughout this series up until this point. I was incredibly confused by that decision because your blue side, do you not want to first pick Maokai? Because I certainly want to first pick Maokai. Certainly with the comps that Fnatic likes to play into, and especially if you're going to be taking away things like the Taliyah, Maokai's priority and his value just skyrockets, in my opinion. And I think Mad finally figured that out. And they went towards that Maokai in game number 3, and now I imagine this is going to be a permaban on the side of Fnatic, because it really did look that good. I'm just surprised it took them this long to get to this point. This is exactly what I was talking about in the previous game, but Elyoya looking a lot better here. Obviously, big ups to the team. They banned Taliyah, and that immediately is going to put them in a better position. Fnatic tried to adapt by going to the Karthus, kind of the other big AP pick that Razork has been pulling out recently, but Karthus is not Taliyah. Taliyah has a lot of impact on the early game, can really start to snowball the game. Karthus takes time to really start moving. You need the rest of the players on the team to really step up and get Karthus to the point where he can take over. It's not nearly as surefire for Fnatic, in my opinion, and I think that was proven very clearly here in Game 3. So, ups to Elyoya, ups to Hylissang. They were the 2 players. Carzzy obviously getting a pentakill is certainly something that we have to point out on Kalista, which is a champion that obviously he's played a ton of over the course of his career, but Carzzy's just been really consistent for this team. Really not a lot of negatives to give Carzzy. He's typically not the one that is separating Mad Lions. He's not really driving them forward by generating his own leads like maybe some of the best ED carries in the region have been able to do, but he still has been really, really good. And I think that, this is maybe the most consistent that Carzzy has been, especially in the last 2 years, but really maybe over the course of his entire career. This has been very good for him. Chasey was much better on the Cassante here. Niski was fine on the Azir. Everything just kind of was better for Mad. I think their draft was better, and I think they executed better. Fnatic is really bad at playing from behind, and they decided to pick a comp that I don't think had nearly as much pressure in the early game, and that's what we'll talk about now. Razork was miserable. He's going to get my dud of the game on the Karthus, obviously trying to abuse that Karthus passive by dying 9 times in this game. It certainly did not look good. This is the problem with Karthus, and the reason that in the BDS series, I talked about it not being a very good pick. I talked about, specifically in the last 2 games, also taking away the Taliyah, making sure that Razork doesn't have the option to go to that or the Ivern in the game, because I do believe that him on anything else is significantly worse, and we've kind of seen that specifically in the early game. And, I've talked ad nauseum about how Razork and Fnatic in general, but specifically Razork, is not very good at playing from a disadvantaged state, especially after the first 10 minutes of the game, and you put him on something like Karthus, he's not really ever going to be able to apply that pressure. You're relying a lot on the Jace and just the Jace to be able to establish that pressure in the mid lane, and Humanoid doesn't play well when Razork doesn't have a ton of prio in the jungle, and so I like this draft from Mad, and I don't like it from Fnatic. I think it kind of goes against how they like to play the game, and I think they figured that out very quickly. Now, not everything was miserable. Noah, I think, continues to play well on the Ezreal this time. He was really good on Ez in the BDS series as well, just a champion that I think he's really proficient at. Noah has been really solid. Trimby's engages were not good, but again, playing Rel from behind is always very difficult. You're playing with an Ezreal early into a Kalista. You're not going to be able to establish that prio, and so the mid game really was not in favor of Trimby, and so couldn't do a whole ton. Humanoid was not very good on the Jace. Really disliked the pick here. This is where banning out the Tristana really kind of proves dividends, if you will, and then I think Wunder just couldn't really do a whole ton. Chasey played a lot better in game number 3, and so Wunder couldn't generate the same kind of tempo, but overall, this loss is expected with how this draft ended up going, in my opinion. I think Mad is starting to learn, starting to figure out the formula, but obviously Fnatic, if you slip up once against them, it's probably going to be the end of the series. You need to keep your foot on the gas, and you need to stay locked in. Is Mad going to be able to do that and stay alive and push us to a Silver Scrapes Game 5? whereas Fnatic going to prove that Game 3 was just a little bit of an outlier and close the series out in 4. Well, the winner of game number 4 was Mad Lions. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to even up this series at 2 apiece, and we are going to a Silver Scrapes game number 5 with the potential for a reverse sweep to get into the grand season finale finals here in the LEC. Big win for Mad. Obviously, their season was on the line, so they had to win a game like this, but being able to go out and actually win it is still incredibly important, and it does show that some of these players are still incredibly underrated and definitely deserve to be mentioned as some of the best players in their role in the region, and I really do believe that they played like that in this game. Kind of a surprising way for Mad to have won. We've talked a lot about how I kind of expected it to be the top side of the map that needed to step up for Mad in order for them to be able to take this series against Fnatic. When you look at when Fnatic loses, it's typically because Razork gets behind and, can't really generate nearly as much pressure and play nearly as aggressively as he would be able to from ahead, or Humanoid just kind of has a bad game and doesn't respect some positioning. Junglers can take advantage of maybe some of his early game mistakes, things like that. It hasn't necessarily been the bot lane, but this game, it absolutely was the bot lane. That was the major gap between these two teams in favor of Mad Lions, and you really have to be excited about that. Player of the game for me, very easily, is going to go to Carzzy on the Kalista. Talked about how this champion has really been a major pick for him, not only over the course of this year, obviously over the course of his entire career. Kalista is a very good champion for those of those who can pilot her at a very high level, and Carzzy's definitely one of them. His team fighting in this series was spectacular. In this game, in this series up until this point, it's just been really good. It's been really consistent. And I think that's really what is pushing Mad over the top in some of these games. Now, I want to give a lot of credit to Hylissang as well. Either of them, I think, could have realistically won player of the game for me, because I do think that both of them played at an incredibly high level. I think Carzzy was a little bit more flashy, obviously, picking up the Penta earlier in this series, now just dominating a lot of these team fights on the Kalista. He's been playing really well, and we've been hyping him up. He's arguably having the best, 3-month stretch of his entire career so far in Summer Split and now in the season finals as well, being probably the best player on this team in the last couple of months, which is pretty crazy. But, him and Hylissang, I think, connecting really well. That was something that we highlighted a lot in the regular season as well, as something that I wasn't expecting coming into the season, but am very pleasantly surprised by. I think both of them obviously didn't have the 2022s that they were looking for, respectively, on their teams. On Vitality for Carzzy, on Fnatic for Hylissang, but coming together here on Mad Lions, I think it has gotten them both back into form, and I think they were both fantastic here. Hilly with the engages, specifically early on in the game, and then once Carzzy was set up, he absolutely took over. But we'll talk about the Fnatic bot lane in just a second. This was one of the worst performances that they've had all year long as a duo. Like I said, we'll talk about them when we get to Fnatic, but I do think everybody else on Mad played well. A lot of comfort. Like I said, I already talked about the Kalista, but the Bel'Veth in the jungle for Elyoya, this is something that we've seen throughout the year. Obviously, Yike is a player that has pulled out a lot of Bel'Veth over the course of this year, but Elyoya, we know, can play it at a ridiculously high level. This was a big narrative going into Worlds last year, and it will continue to be a narrative for Elyoya as a player. European junglers do like this champion quite a bit, and we see the power of it. We see what it can do if it does get to that late game. It can be a little bit of a monster in basically every facet of the game. It can really do whatever you need it to do, and that's, I think, why Bel'Veth is such a good pick in a circumstance like this. Rel is one of those champions on the other side of the map that really does have a defined playstyle of gank early, get your lanes ahead, and try to be such a nuisance and such an aggressive factor in the mid game that it's very difficult for the enemy, especially if they have low mobility carries, to play the game. But if you get Rel behind, all of a sudden that job becomes significantly harder, and I think Elyoya did a really good job of that here. Chasey had probably his most secure game of the entire series. He's really struggled up until this point, but this was pretty good, and Nisqy was fine on the Azir as well. Didn't make any game-losing errors, which is all you can really ask for at this point. The bot lane was good enough to be able to carry them across the finish line, and carry them they did. And then for Fnatic on the other side, what happened, man? Like, what happened in this game to Noah? I can't even begin to tell you what was going through his brain in a lot of these plays. He's a pretty easy choice for dead of the game. This is his worst game in the LEC, and I don't even think it's particularly close. I can't remember a game where Noah just went, like, brain off, like, I gotta play to win or to lose instantly in every single fight, quite like you did here in game number 4. He's playing Zeri. He has a bit of gold. A lot of that gold was generated off of trades, and so it's not necessarily the most efficient gold because you're giving quite a bit over to Mad Lions as well, but at the very least, you have opportunities to be able to do something in the late game. You're going to be able to outscale the Kalista. If you just position a little bit, carefully, there is an opportunity for you to be able to win some of these fights if you get good engages from the Rel and the Rakan. You have the Xerath backing it up in terms of damage and, some of these team fights, but Noah was playing like a frontline bruiser the entire game, and I can't tell you why. He was consistently caught out. Hylissang in particular was basically just staring at the Zeri and was very, very interested in getting on her at the beginning of every single fight, and it worked. Like, Noah wasn't avoiding anything. He was just walking up, getting caught, maybe doing some damage and then dying very early on in every single fight. This was very atypical for what Noah has been offering us as a player. And I don't know, I have to assume it's an outlier, right? I have to assume this isn't going to affect the rest of the series, but it is worth noting now. The rest of the team didn't exactly play great. I don't think Razork made any sort of major errors, but Mad Lions got a lot of the tempo through their bot lane, and so just kind of started getting out of control, and the Rel became less and less useful as the game went on. Xerath is one of those picks that I'm not sure whether to call bait or whether to call it, like, fairly balanced, because Xerath is one of those champions that continuously does a ton of damage and continuously has a lot of pressure, but really fails to make, like, a game-winning impact in a lot of these games. Like, it's one of you see the production, and you're like, yeah, Xerath always looks good, but the rest of the team never looks good around it. I'm not sure if that's because Xerath really doesn't offer all that much pressure, like, it really doesn't, like, take over games in the same way that some of the other mid laners in the current meta do, or if it's just one of those things, right, where it's been a little bit unlucky in maybe the 7 to 10 games that we've seen it in Pro, but it really has not been all that successful, even if it's looked okay. Wunder probably had his worst game of the series. It's okay, it's game 4. Basically, everybody played bad for Fnatic, but this was a big win for Mad. 25 minutes, pretty dominant. Your bot lane looking great. You've got all the momentum in this series right now going into a game number 5. You have won 2 games in a row, and Fnatic can't afford to lose this. They're on the back foot, obviously. The loser of this is eliminated. The winner of this moves on to the finals to take on G2, so a very big matchup. But who's going to be able to take it? Well, the winner and moving on to the finals in game number 5 was Fnatic. They are gonna take game number 5. They are going to take this series, and maybe not super surprisingly, they are going to be moving on to face G2 in the season finals, which I know, again, is a very weird statement to make, but congratulations to Fnatic. This is a very, very big win. This team, this organization looked absolutely doomed after Spring Split. To see everything that they have been able to do over the past few months, to see them still be able to rally around this team, even though they have to sub in Wunder in the top lane, which we'll get to, is certainly not a downgrade by any means in terms of how he has played over the last few series, but making any sort of change, right before this major tournament bracket run is still a very big deal, and being able to continue playing at a very high level like you were at the end of the regular season is incredibly great for them, and being able to finally assert their spot as a top 2 team for the first time in 2023 at the most important time here right now is obviously fantastic for this team. I'm really proud of them, what they've been able to do, but for Mad Lions on the other side, it's disappointing. I think that this team has constantly been in the top 2 conversation basically all year, with the exception of everything that happened in the summer split. Everything kind of went wrong for them, but it really did feel like they kind of took summer off and they were kind of preparing for this tournament in particular. And while they did get the job done and they've qualified for Worlds and they don't have to worry about going through play-ins or anything like that, they're automatically in the Swiss stage. I think they expected more, and yes, they took Fnatic to 5 games, which is great, but I don't think they necessarily looked fantastic in this series, which we will obviously get to. But let's talk about Fnatic first and foremost. Player of the game for me in Game 5 is going to go to Trimby in the support position. I very much considered him for player of the series. I'm not quite going to give it to him, although he's definitely my second option here for Fnatic. I thought he was much, much better in Game 5. This is easily his best game of the series. I think that there have been times throughout his run on Fnatic where he has shown some of the flashes that got him sent to Fnatic in the first place, some of the bad play that he had on Koi in the spring split, over the course of the middle part of this year, but for the most part, he's been a major upgrade towards what this team had basically at any point in this season. Really, there hasn't been any sort of support play on Fnatic all year long that has been dominant. Advienne, I think, at the very least, offered some morale for this team and was obviously a very good leader, a very good character guy in the locker room, but I think the on-Rift play for Trimby has really elevated what this team has been capable of over the course of this year, and I do think that this is the kind of game that you're just not getting from any of the other players that have been playing support for Fnatic over the course of this year, and And this is why you bring in Trimby. This was an elite level performance in a game that really, really mattered for them. And I think obviously it was a little bit of a mistake for Mad to not ban the Alistar. I think that that's going to be what a lot of people point to, but Trimby's just a really good player. I think when you give him the keys to be able to go out and be a playmaker, to be really aggressive, to go and try and make a lot of these moves happen, I think he's going to capitalize on that, and I think he's going to look really good in those circumstances. Can still be a little bit flip-floppy as we saw in that game number 4, but is a really, really solid player, and I think, was a big reason why they were able to take it home here in game 5. Player of the series for me is going to go to Razork in the jungle. He's been incredibly influential and essential, honestly, for this team across their season finals run up until this point. He's probably been the best player on Fnatic and certainly the most important. His champion pool, I think, obviously is a big, deal for what Fnatic wants to do in terms of style. The Ivern, the Talia, the Karthus, things like that have been able to come out. I think it opens up the door for maybe some of what the rest of this team is going to be playing as well, but you can still go for mages in the mid lane. Something like the Syndra is certainly a humanoid pocket pick. We saw that in the BDS series. We're seeing that again here in game 5 of the Mad Lions series, and I do believe that Razork transitioning to something like the Ivern and being more of a supportive role and looking as good as he has, in positions like that is still very, very important. We've always kind of associated Razork more with, resources and with trying to carry games, because I do think, at least on Fnatic, that's kind of been the narrative that he has created for himself. When he is able to carry, he looks really good. When he gets behind, he looks pretty bad, but I think across this series, he was a lot more versatile in terms of how he played the game, and Razork in general, I think, is playing his best League of 2023 right now, which is a great time for that to happen. Humanoid's been shockingly consistent over the course of this tournament. Hasn't been this dynamic, dominating carry, but this is a lot more, I think, the Humanoid that we got on Mad Lions before he came over to Fnatic a couple of years ago, where he would have moments where he would dominate games, and he's obviously always going to be at least a little bit of a coin flippy player like he was on Mad, but for the most part can just be a positive on things like Syndra or, even some of the more aggressive picks that we've seen throughout the playoff run. I think Humanoid's been really good. Wunder has stepped in and been fantastic. He has gapped both of the top laners he's played, whether that be Adam, whether that be Chasey, neither of whom are complete pushovers, although Chasey certainly is playing like one right now. And then Noah certainly had his poor moments. Game 4 was really bad from him, but basically every other game in this series was really solid, so I'm going to look at that game a little bit more as an outlier than maybe you would expect. But Fnatic looking fantastic, and they deserve to go to finals. And then for Matt on the other side, it's hard to get a grip on this team on what they are, because I think that there are moments where they look really good and where a lot of these players end up stepping up, especially when games matter more. And there are also moments where basically the exact opposite happens, and it's like, what did we see in this team at all? And that's kind of how game 5 went, in my opinion. I think when you're looking at what you expected out of Mad, some people expected this performance. I expected a little bit more. I think I expected somewhere in the middle of what we got in games 3 and 4 and what we got in games 1, 2, and 5, right? Where when they won, they looked really good. When they lost, they looked really, really bad. Carzzy and Hilly, I think, are still the best part of this team, or at least at the current moment, are the best part of this team, which is crazy because you have Elyoya in the jungle. You have Niski in the mid lane, who have been very big power players over the course of the last 2 years in the LEC. For Elyoya, it's been even more than that, and it just didn't feel like they were really all that there. Now, Niski really wasn't a major problem, especially towards the back half of this series, but Elyoya certainly wasn't breaking the bank. Razork was definitely the better jungler in this series, which is disappointing. And Chasey was miserable, and he was really bad against G2 as well. It's starting to become at least a little bit of a concern. Chasey was always somebody who I think stepped up more in the best of 5s than he did in a lot of the other areas of the game, and that just was not the case in these past 2 series. He's going to need to get his form back before Worlds, or else I think he's really going to get abused by some of the better top laners in the world. But for Mad, at least you're going to Worlds. You don't have to worry about it too much. Season Finals really is more of an ego check than anything else, and so for Mad, you get a little bit more time to prepare for that international tournament, to figure out maybe the style that you want to run. And I do have faith in these players. I think that there is an opportunity for them to maybe surprise some people in terms of their outcome at Worlds. I'm not necessarily going to entirely expect that, but it's okay. It's good enough. And then for Fnatic, congratulations. This is a big win. You're moving on to finals. This is a very big finals matchup. Nobody saw Fnatic in the finals like 4 months ago. That would have been a pretty bold take for you to say the Fnatic was a top 2 team. I certainly didn't believe that. I was lower on this team, and that certainly has not turned out to be an ideal take. But at the end of the day, this team has rallied around some of their new acquisitions. They've really formed a nice cohesion, and even swapping out top laners hasn't really been able to stop their momentum. It's going to be interesting to see if they can take down G2, but that's a series that we're going to get to talk about right now. But that does now bring us to our season finals overview and analysis section of this video. With the semifinals out of the way, we've only got 2 teams remaining. One of these 2 will be the #1 seed from the LEC going to Worlds and will officially be your 2023 LEC champions. I believe that's how that works. Obviously, we've got all 3 of the splits, but it's all leading up to this major tournament to determine the champions of basically the whole year in the LEC. So a very, very big opportunity for both of these teams. And, you know, when you're talking about the 2 biggest organizations in Europe, you're looking at a pretty predictable finals in terms of the 2 teams that ended up getting here. It was a rocky road to end up with these 2 teams, but they always end up here. Of course, it is a matchup between G2 Esports and Fnatic, the 2 titans of European League of Legends. They have made it back. Of course, very different roads, G2 being the best team in the LEC basically all year long. There really hasn't been a ton of moments where a lot of people have looked at G2 as anything other than the best team in the LEC. Obviously got the job done in both winter and in summer. Couldn't quite get it done in spring. Ended up losing to Mad Lions to get 4th place. Mad went on to win the entire tournament, but they ended up getting their revenge at MSI anyways, being able to take down Mad. And there really aren't a lot of, you know, games and series that have shown that G2 is even on the same level as a lot of the other LEC teams. They look infinitely better than basically everybody that they've played against, and I think a lot of people would expect that to be the case against Fnatic as well. But as we've seen from Fnatic in recent series, they are certainly not going to go down without a fight. They have played 3 series here in the season finals. All 3 of them have gone to all 5 games. They have played 15 games across 3 series, which is intense and insane, and they've won all 3 of those series, which is a huge deal. Obviously, players like Razork are playing really well right now. Trimby has had some really good games. Wunder, I think, is playing really well and will get an opportunity after being subbed in this tournament to play in the finals, which is insane, but you're going to need everybody to step up. Humanoid and Noah are going to need to play incredibly well. Noah has been a little bit more of a question mark over the past few series than he was in the regular season, where he just was one of the best AD carries in the entire region. Humanoid obviously is notoriously inconsistent. It's just kind of how he plays the game, but he has been a little bit better over the course of this tournament, and so I think if you get the best version of Fnatic, this could be a little bit more of a series than maybe a lot of people are anticipating. But again, it's just impossible to bet against G2. They are the best team in Europe until proven otherwise, and I'm going to continue to pick them as the favorites going into this series. But let's go ahead and see if that does end up paying off. Stylistically, I do think that G2 has an advantage here. I think the consistency that they offer, I think their aggression matches Fnatic, but they're just a little bit better at executing that aggression. I think typically speaking, you would say that G2 has a stylistic matchup advantage into Fnatic, but again, we've seen, you know, players do better or worse, you know, than maybe expected specifically on the Fnatic team. And so, gonna be a fun finals, but of course, going game by game means we kick it off with game #1, and the winner of game #1 was G2 Esports. They are going to take the first game of this series. They're going to go up 1-0, assert their dominance very, very early on. And this was just a G2 game. This was very, very good, very, very typical, I would say, for what G2 has been able to do over the past few months. They just were able to outskill and outpressure their opponents, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Their team fighting was basically perfection. Even if there were some mishaps in the laning phase from a couple of their players, we will get into that. Once they got into the part of the game where they could play as a unit and where they could really express that they are just a little bit more mechanically talented than maybe the opposition that they're going into, all of a sudden the game ends up getting blown wide open, and there really aren't a lot of opportunities for Fnatic to be able to get themselves back into it. I think that there were a couple of players in particular that played phenomenal over the back half of this game. This was a bit of a banger. A lot of the fights were very interesting, and I would recommend going to check this game out if you want just kind of a fun game, even one that's maybe not entirely the most close towards the back half. It was just a really, really fun one to watch for Fnatic. I think that you tried your best. A couple of pretty big misplays, but I think this was mostly G2 being good rather than Fnatic being awful, and I think that that's a pretty good thing to say in the long run. But let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the game for me, 2-horse race here for G2. I'm going to end up giving it to Broken Blade up in the top lane. This is certainly not an unfamiliar thing for people who have watched the channel over the past few weeks and really the past year or two. Broken Blade has been phenomenal. I mean, it's not even a question anymore. Over the past, especially like month, but even really over the past year, he has unquestionably been the best top laner in Europe. It's not even really up for debate anymore. He has really been the best version of himself over this past year. I think Broken Blade has really solidified himself as someone that you have to watch out for basically no matter what team he has played for. G2 has some sort of magic voodoo that makes players play completely unselfishly when they need to. Sometimes it can be, you know, a little bit, we've seen Caps maybe get a little bit distracted. We've seen players like Yike and Mickey get a little bit distracted, but for the most part, when these players need to start playing for the team, G2 G2 as this magic sauce of being able to get them to buy in and do that, and that's really what's happened with Broken Blade here. He was a little bit up and down in the laning phase. I think you could argue that Wunder actually had a much better laning phase than Broken Blade did, but the team fight stage of the game, the K'Sante just absolutely took over. We saw basically every single negative thing you could say about that champion and about how overpowered he is in this game. It was unreal how much damage he was doing, considering he built full tank, but that's just how it goes with K'Sante sometimes. The other player that you can point out for player of the game that played incredibly well was Yike on the Rel in this game. We know that Rel can still pop off. I know I talk a lot on this channel about how Rel is a little bit more feast or famine than maybe people give her credit for, because I do really believe that, you know, Rel's not this, like, insta-win kind of champion. She's not pick her in the jungle and then all of a sudden everybody else doesn't matter because, you know, if she dominates the game, then the game is over. I do think that you still have to execute on Rel incredibly well in order for her to be as, you know, versatile and useful as you would want her to be in that jungle position. But when you are able to generate that early pressure, and when Yike was engaging like he was in the late game, it's almost impossible to play against this. I mean, the Rel was consistently getting on the Aphelios, and look at the rest of the comp for Fnatic. If Aphelios goes down, the game is over. The team fight is over. And so, really good stuff from Broken Blade and Yike. They were the best players. Mickey had a really good game. Caps had a really good game. Hans got himself into trouble, I think, throughout this game a little bit more than maybe I would have liked, but for the most part, G2 was still just the better team, and I think they showed that. And then for Fnatic on the other side, like I said, G2 was definitely better rather than Fnatic just being awful. I don't think they made any sort of major errors. Players like Wunder, I think, had, you know, good laning phases, weren't particularly awful in the early game. The problem was they just got outscaled. When you're looking at a team comp that's really relying on basically a front-to-back with Aphelios as your main carry, you're looking for engages coming out with potential Renekton flanks, with potential Maokai ultimates. You know, you're really looking for that. When you get a Rel that's going to be able to basically push the tempo a lot faster than what you want in the late game, it becomes significantly harder, especially if the Aphelios is the first one to get caught, which did end up being a problem. Noah is going to get my dead of the game here in game number 1. Noah's been a question mark for this team. I'm certainly not going to lie. He has not been nearly as good in the best of 5s as he was in the regular season. Now, that's not to say that he can't be as good in the best of 5s. I do think that maybe some of the inconsistencies are being shown a tad bit more. Maybe some of the more aggressive tendencies are being shown a tad bit more, but we've still seen the good parts of Noah, the parts that really made us, you know, start to believe in him as a top 80 carry in the first place in the summer split. He's just maybe a little bit more inconsistent than we were giving him credit for. This was a game where I think you could definitely show that off. Humanoid was just kind of meh on his signature Syndra that we've seen over the course of these finals. Was just okay. Trimby didn't really do a whole ton. Razork was definitely out-jungled by Yike and didn't have nearly the same kind of team fight pressure in the back half of the game. There really just wasn't a lot that Fnatic could do once G2 started to turn on the pressure, especially with full tank K'Sante doing so much damage and absolutely taking over a lot of these fights. And so, you know, it's not the worst game in the world, but Fnatic does have to bounce back. Going down 2-0 to G2 is a death sentence. Like, there aren't a lot of teams in the world that I'm going to say, like, oh, going down 0-2 just, like, loses you the series, but having to win 3 games in a row against G2 Esports in a finals arena, that's going to be nearly impossible. It's going to be a task that you don't want to have to set yourself up for. So, big game here for Fnatic, but can G2 take that win and establish their dominance, really put a stamp on this series starting off 2-0, or is Fnatic going to be able to tie everything up? Well, the winner of game number 2 was G2. They are going to take game number 2. G2 takes G2, and the curse is broken. G2 not completely inting the game away in a game number 2. That is certainly not something that we've become accustomed to with G2 over the course of basically every playoff run, but nope, this was just a genuinely clean 25-minute absolute domination from G2. This was not a close game. I want to be completely upfront about that. In game 1, there were some moments where Fnatic looked good, especially early on, but by the end of the game, things just really started to pull away for G2, and they were definitely showing to be the better team. Not the case here in game number 2. This was a dominating victory for G2 just in general. They were the better team minute 1. They were the better team minute 25. It just kind of is what it is sometimes, and I think we're really seeing that their domination and their dominance over the LEC is going to continue even here in the finals, where they've definitely been the better team across the first 2 games. I wish I could hype this one up just a little bit more, but there really isn't a lot of hyping that I think I can do. Fnatic did not play well in this. A lot of, I don't want to say uncharacteristic mistakes, because Fnatic certainly has made their mistakes over the course of this split, but they definitely came out in game number 2. This was way worse than game number 1 from them, in my opinion. But let's talk about G2, of course. First, player of the game for me, I mean, honestly, everyone played well, everyone won lane, everyone dominated This wasn't like a one lane kind of taking over the game and translating the pressure everywhere. Everybody won 1v1. Like, it's just kind of how it was. But player of the game in terms of, you know, the stat sheet and the domination score is definitely going to go to Hansama in the bot lane on this Kai'Sa. He was kind of the more questionable member, I would say, in game number 1. Certainly the one that I think Fnatic was trying to put more resources into trying to shut down. But in game number 2, he really got ahead and he really got out and about. I think that you look at this comp, I'm not a huge fan of the, like, artillery combo of Jace plus Kai'Sa anymore. I still think it can be very useful, especially if you are the better team. And you know you're going to be able to get to that mid game and be really proactive there, but there are some concerns, especially if your jungler loses early, about whether or not you're going to be able to translate the power of Jace into the part of the game where Kai'Sa is going to be able to dominate, but G2 didn't have any problems like that in this game. Yike was everywhere. Caps, I think, was really good on the Jace, but Hans in particular was really good on the Kai'Sa and was really able to start dominating very early on. By the time we got to the mid-game skirmishes, the Kai'Sa was already out of control, and if you're at that point, like, yeah, Kai'Sa's going to dominate the game basically no matter who else is on the team with her. Mickey continuing to pull out the Lissandra support. This is something that obviously they pulled out against Mad Lions in the semifinals, or in the winners finals, I should say, and they looked pretty good on it. Certainly not like a pick that I would expect to work against the best teams in the world. I do think you need to be incredibly aggro in order to pull this off, especially with something like Kai'Sa, and I'm not necessarily sure that's always going to be available to you, but against a Fnatic team that had a really poor draft with a lot of really poor options for engage, I do think that, you know, Lissandra was a really good counter option for that, and I think it did really, really well. If you're going to be able to pick Lissandra, it's pretty optimal to be able to pick it into things like Taliyah and Syndra, in my opinion. And then you've got the Olaf in the top lane. Olaf's one of those champions that I'm just always going to be both excited and frustrated to see at the pro level, because it really is just one of those champions that is going to run at you. And it's either, he's a stat stick. He's either going to be super fed or he's not, right? He's either going to kill you instantly or he's not. The rest of the team, I think, was really strong at that point. Broken Blade's still playing incredibly well and was very dominant, especially towards the back half of the game. But for the most part, everybody on G2 dominated. There really isn't a lot of negatives that I can give to this team with how they played here. And then for Fnatic on the other side, this was not a good game. I mean, first of all, I'm not really one to complain about draft. I mean, I do a little bit more frequently now than before, because I do think that sometimes you give yourself weird options, and I really don't like this from Fnatic. I really don't understand the idea of it. Zyrakon's really strong. I think it's a really good, you know, end of draft pick, but I just don't understand Taliyah Syndra as a duo. I don't understand what the idea behind it is. Like, I get that Razork loves to play Taliyah and Humanoid prefers to play Syndra. Like, they're champions that I think the players are definitely comfortable with. But as a duo, I don't really think it offers anything. Like, if I'm being entirely honest, I just don't understand it. Maybe there are some people in the comments that can, you know, enlighten me on maybe what they were thinking behind going for this. But I just don't think that this is ever going to be a mid-jungle duo that gives you any sort of pressure or really helps you play your style in any way, shape, or form. You're really relying on the Taliyah at that point to be able to establish a ton of pressure early, because the Syndra just kind of isn't going to do that against Jace. It can be relatively safe, but it's not like they're going to completely outscale the Kai'Sa and really get to the part of the game where you're going to make her job a lot harder. It's not really going to happen with these two, and so I don't necessarily understand why you go for this, and I think it definitely turned out to be a little bit of a problem for them here. Razork is going to get my dud of the game on the Taliyah. A lot of big misplays from Razork in this game, and you know, he's been on a really good stretch as of late, but let's not forget that Razork is a relatively inconsistent player. That's kind of what he's been known for over the course of his whole career, even going back to his time on Misfits. It's not like he was ever the most consistent game-to-game player. He's just had ridiculous highs, and that's why he's always been considered one of the best junglers in the region. But, you know, when you get a game like this where he really is set behind early, where G2 really is clicking, when they start getting a lot of gold and all of a sudden Razork has to start making these more risky plays, all of a sudden things start falling off the wheels for Fnatic, and really that is kind of how this team plays, and I think Razork was kind of the example of that, if you will, this game. Obviously, him sitting on the zombie ward forever was definitely a highlight and what a lot of people are going to look at, or a low light, I would say, for Fnatic, but there were a lot of other misplays. I think mechanically speaking, Razork was also just not very good in this game. He kind of just misplayed in a lot of different areas. I think Humanoid was actually pretty good. Certainly the best performing member of Fnatic, in my opinion, was certainly trying to do quite a bit. He is very good at Syndra, but this champion's just not going to be able to do all that much in this circumstance. The long range of both Jace and Kai'Sa really means that Syndra's not going to be able to, you know, really engage in any sort of way or actually be able to take any fights on her terms. She's really going to have to hope and pray that G2 messes up in order for her to do things. And then Olaf plus Lissandra is very difficult. If they really understand that they want to focus down the Syndra in particular, there's really not a lot that you can do as an immobile backline burst mage to be able to get away from Olaf, to be able to get away from Lissandra. And so just not a good game for Syndra to be able to take over. So if Humanoid's your best player, that's a problem. Trimby continuously went in. This is one of those games that I was talking about that's a lot more reminiscent of Koi Trimby than it is Fnatic Trimby, where he's just going to like perma go in no matter the game state and just constantly die. I don't necessarily blame him. It's going to happen. You're on recon. You're going to try to make plays, but there were a lot of bad plays in this game. Noah didn't hit a single root on Xayah. His mechanics have been really poor over the last two series, the last like 5 games or so. Don't really know if that's a problem that I should continue to be looking into, but it's certainly worth noting, and Wunder's fine. He's whatever on the top side. He didn't exactly win, but he didn't exactly lose either. Top lane's very rarely going to win or lose you the game, but, Humanoid was fine. Everybody else in Fnatic was really bad, and now you're down 0-2. This is a disastrous scenario. You have to win 3 games in a row against G2 in order to be able to crown yourselves as champions. It's not, impossible in the fact that, it's not 0%, but it's pretty darn close. It's going to be a very difficult task. Of course, that means you got to start with game number 3, but G2 has the opportunity to close this out in a pretty clean sweep and really assert their dominance over everybody else in the LEC. Are they going to be able to do that, or is Fnatic going to be able to keep the series alive? Well, the winner of game number 3 was Fnatic. They are going to take game number 3. They are going to stay alive in this series. It's not going to be a sweep at the very least, because they are going to take their first game of the finals here, and they looked so much better in game 3 than they did really at any point in games 1 and 2. There were moments in game 1 where I think they looked solid. They were kind of matching aggression at the very least at the early part of the game. Game 2 was an absolute demolition game for G2 though, and so Fnatic really needed to show something in this game number 3 to at least make me believe that they had some kind of talent that was on remotely the same level as G2, and at the very least, they did show that in game number 3. I think the players that needed to step up did go ahead and end up stepping up, and obviously that's very, very important for them to be able to win so confidently is great, but I've definitely got some problems with how G2 ended up playing this game. I think their draft is very questionable. I think it's very much an ego game for G2, which is fine when you're up 2-0, but it is the finals. You should probably be taking some of these games seriously. It probably won't end up coming back to bite them. Obviously, we don't know yet, but let's go ahead and talk about Fnatic first and foremost. This isn't entirely about G2 or anything like that. Player of the game for me in game 3 is going to go to Noah, and I've been very critical of Noah over the course of these last few series. I really don't think he's been playing all that well. A lot of people have been talking about the nerves. A lot of people have been talking about how shaky he is looking just personally, like on stage. He very much does not look comfortable playing at a level and at a stage this big at this point in his career, which I think is very much shown on the Rift. I don't necessarily think that, it's an inconquerable thing and that's something that's going to affect him 100% internationally. But it is worth noting that he has definitely looked a lot more shaky in these big games than he did in the regular season, which is fine, but this was definitely kind of a calming performance, I think, for him as a player. He looked so much better in this game, and he looked so much better after this game was over as well, and I think that's definitely going to be a positive for Fnatic. If he can play a lot more like this, that's obviously going to help them a ton. Moving into the future, his Kai'Sa was basically perfect. He was doing so much damage this game, was consistently in positions where he could play aggressive, but also wasn't giving over free resources. That was kind of the problem. It's not that he wasn't aggressive enough, was rather that he was too aggressive in terms of his positioning, and he was consistently getting caught out by very good engaged players on the other team, and especially when Fnatic would draft these comps where he was the primary carry in the back half in the teamfight stage on things like Aphelios, he really needed to be a lot more reliable, and that was something he wasn't. He still maintained that aggressiveness in this game, but I don't think he did it at the cost of stability, and I think that is the sweet spot. That's what we saw from him in the regular season. That's why his KDA was so ridiculous across the regular season games, because he was doing that so consistently. So really nice game from Noah here. I think the rest of the team also played well. Trimby with a pretty solid game on the Nautilus. I think Wunder continues to play really well in the top lane. I think that he has been arguably the second best top laner in the season finals, only behind Broken Blade in terms of the performances that he's been able to put out, which is crazy. Again, I have to reiterate, because he's a substitute for this team, and so really good stuff from him. Razork was a lot more consistent, I think, in the mid game here. I think Maokai in general just helps out Fnatic a ton. It's a champion that I think really plays into some of their strengths, and I think Razork pilots it well. Humanoid didn't make any major errors on Azir, which again, like we've talked about, is all he really needs to not do is not lose the game for his team, and as long as Noah is playing well, then they're going to have a chance to win, and when he plays like this, they're definitely going to have a chance to win. So nice game from them. And then for G2 on the other side, some good and some bad. I hate this draft. I really don't think that I think it's an ego draft. I'll be entirely honest. I don't think you pick this if you genuinely feel like you're not just way better than your opponent. The fact that they were even remotely in this game, I think, has more to do with the fact that they're so confident at the current moment, and they feel like they have so much momentum and pressure going into a game like this that they're willing to pull something out like this, because I think in a lot of circumstances, a draft like this just isn't going to work. It is full throttle with basically one, kind of secondary resource like, win condition in the back half of the game being the Sivir. But if you follow follow the channel, you know how much I don't like the Sivir pick in the current meta. I don't think Sivir is really all that efficient. I think there are a lot of really good late game AD carries, but few have the complete zero in the early and mid game that Sivir has. She's really not a champion before 2 items, and even then, it probably takes until 3 before she actually gets strong, and so you need to hit that part of the game, and I think Hans definitely experienced that. Hans was really bad in this game. I don't think it was necessarily just the champion. I think he himself performed rather poorly, and, you know, I've been a bit concerned about Hans. He's played worse, I think, in the season finals than he did in the regular season. Not super concerned, just something to at least point out. This was his worst game of the series by a considerable margin. Caps was able to generate some gold on the Yone, but I think Yone in this comp is a big reason why I just don't think there's a ton of upside on it. If you're super far ahead, Yone plus Rel plus Rakan is going to be a really dangerous duo to have to play against in the mid game, but going into Maokai and Nautilus and a lot of these other champions, it's very hard for this comp to actually stay relevant if you're not ahead in the late game, and so that ended up being a problem. The Sivir was useless, the Yone ended up falling off super hard, and the Rel engages just didn't really matter by the time we hit the late game because there really wasn't enough damage to be able to break through the really strong front line that Fnatic ended up offering. I think just in general, the entire team kind of ended up not playing nearly as consistently towards the back half of the game, and I do think it affected them. Obviously, Mickey was a little bit worse. I think the bot lane in general was a little worse, and Broken Blade didn't nearly have the same kind of performances. I think this was the first game of the series where I really felt like Wunder was the better top laner, which is good to see from Wunder, but it is worth noting that I still think Broken Blade has been playing incredibly well, and he certainly wasn't the biggest problem in this game. I think in general for G2, what you're looking at is maybe a better, well-rounded comp. I think if you give yourself an option to be able to outplay Fnatic in the late game, even if the early game, you know, 50-50 mid-game fights or whatever don't end up going your way, I think that's obviously going to be a better idea. It's going to give you a lot more options, and it's going to allow you to actually be the better team, whereas I think this is kind of risking the game a little bit more in the first, 10 to 15 minutes, which can be a little bit volatile, especially against a team like Fnatic. So G2 definitely, a little bit more concerned, I would say, after this game, but it's still not panic mode by any means. Like, you still have full control of this series. You're still only 1 game away from being the LEC champions. Fnatic absolutely has to keep their foot on the gas. Yes, you won game 3, but it is not over. You've got to win 2 more. So are they going to be able to do it, or was game 3 just a little bit of an outlier? Well, the winner of game number 4 was G2. They are going to take game number 4. They're going to close out this series. They are going to prove that game 3 was a little bit more of an outlier than maybe it was an example of what Fnatic could do. And they're going to run away with this title. This is another championship in the cap of G2's. Not only have they won so much in the past, but this year they've won 3 of the 4 major tournaments in Europe. They are the kings of Europe. They are the best team in the LEC. And it's not particularly close. Your winter champions, your best performing team at MSI, your summer champions, and now your LEC season final champions. G2 has won basically everything that they can win and proven everything that they can prove domestically at this point. Obviously, there's going to be questions about what they can do internationally. That has to be where the focus is for this team at this point, but them continuing to dominate as much as they have and really show just, like, quite frankly, how superior they are to everybody else that they're playing against has been noted, and it's certainly something that's going to be interesting once we get to some international events. For Fnatic on the other side, obviously, it's frustrating, it's disappointing to come in second place. Never really the spot you want to be in, coming so close and not necessarily being able to make it happen, but this is still a very good outcome, I would say, for Fnatic in general, especially when you compare it to the expectations that people had, not only for this team at the beginning of the split, let alone that, but at the beginning of the year. I mean, even when people still had some high expectations for what could potentially happen with this Fnatic team, I don't think a lot of people saw them as a top 2 team. I certainly didn't. And so for them to end the season as one of the top 2 teams, as an automatic qualifier for the World Championships, the number 2 seed from Europe going to Worlds, that's still a pretty good outcome, even if they didn't necessarily, play all that well in this series, if I'm being honest. So let's talk about it. Game number 4, G2 looked really, really good. Player of the game for me is going to go to Caps. I think that he was just really, really good in this game. I think there's a very, very big case to be made that he is player of the series overall. I'm not quite going to give it to him, although I'm very, very close. I think that he was probably the most consistent member of G2 across this entire series. Didn't necessarily have the same kind of highs that I think some other players had, but Caps is just really good, and I think he absolutely stepped up. He pulls out the Syndra here in game 4, the thing that Fnatic has been going to very consistently. They go for something that's a little bit more traditional to, how they were playing earlier in the tournament, the Ivern plus the Talia that we've seen try to control the map very early on, but it's not going to work nearly as well when Caps is the best player on the Rift, and he's able to play a backline low mobility burst mage like it's the best roamer in the entire game. That's all of a sudden a lot more difficult to be able to end up going up into it, and Caps' positioning was basically perfect throughout this entire game. I mean, when you want that superstar level performance, you know, I've said it multiple times, Caps is, in my opinion, without even really any parallel, the greatest European League of Legends player of all time. I don't even think it's really all that up for debate. I think he's the most dominant and certainly the most successful, but I think that he is just, when you get that level, when you get Caps performing as the #1 player in Europe, then it's just over. There's really not a lot that anybody else is going to be able to do to play into him in that same kind of way. So really nice game from him. I think obviously everybody else played really well. Yike had a really good game on the Rel. I think it's almost honestly going to go a little bit underrated. I know that Rel engages are quote unquote simple, but we talked about it. You have to be able to generate momentum and pressure in the game. And I think him and Caps have developed such a good chemistry in the jungle mid duo that it just becomes so automatic that a lot of these plays end up working. Rel plus Syndra really isn't one of those combos that I think is like an insta-win or anything like that, but it felt like an insta-win because G2 ended up playing it so well. And then, of course, Hans and Mickey, I think, had a really good game here. They pull out the Draven Leona, want to be aggressive early. This is something that they did a lot more earlier on in the year. Obviously, later in the year, they transitioned to more protect the late game AD carry comps with Braum and, you know, things like Kog'Maw, and that's obviously, I think, what G2 has become a little bit more notable for in the back half of the year, but they were playing almost exclusively Draven in the winter split when they ended up winning the title, and so, you know, they can do whatever they want. They're just really, really good at the game, and obviously these players are very versatile. But player of the series for me, maybe surprisingly, is going to go to Broken Blade in the top lane. I really do think he's been the MVP for G2 over the past few weeks, and I know that a lot of people are maybe gonna agree with that. I don't think I'm going to get nearly as much agreement as I would with some other picks, but I really do believe that Broken Blade has been the best player in the LEC for the past, you know, a couple weeks. I think he was the most important player in this tournament for any team, and I really do think that that's incredibly impressive to be able to say. If Broken Blade is on top form going into an international tournament, which, yes, I'm happy to acknowledge isn't always the case with him, I think that's going to be massive for G2, because honestly, there are some really good teams going to Worlds that have some average top laners. Top lane's not really a position that's all that dominant across the world right now. There were a couple of really good ones, but outside of that, there really aren't a lot of, like, crazy dominant ones, 3 or 4 at most. And so Broken Blade might be on the same level as some of these other top laners, and that could be an avenue that G2 wants to try to capitalize on when they do go international, especially if he's going to play like this. But everybody on this team, and I mean that, everybody on this team played out of their minds. They're all ridiculously good, and they deserve to be champions here. And like I said, for Fnatic, obviously didn't play very well in this series. Game 3 was really nice to be able to show that you can do it, but they basically reverted right back to their Game 2 form here in the final game of the series, and not exactly what you want to see. I think players like Razork and Noah were so important towards getting here in the first place for Fnatic, and they played really poorly in this series. Razork's going to be my dud of the game here in Game 4. Noah, I think, played really poorly outside of Game 3 across this entire series. I think that he was majorly outclassed basically in every game, and it's fine. It's going to happen. You're a little bit worried about potentially the nerves being an issue for Noah in particular as a player, somebody who has visibly shown that the nerves are definitely there. He's able to overcome it. We saw that in Game 3, but the consistency to be able to overcome that is going to be very important towards this team's long-term projection, because I really don't think they're going to win a lot of games if Noah is not playing like a very good AD carry at the very least an LEC level, right? Like a top 2 or 3 LEC AD carry. If he's not at that level, I think Fnatic is going to struggle to be able to win some games internationally, but we know he has that in him, and that's the reason Fnatic's here in the first place. I think Razork and Humanoid were fine across this series. I think they went for comfort instead of meta, and I think it didn't end up paying off against a team that's going to be able to capitalize on the really good meta picks and basically play them like their comfort, but Razork was kind of poor across this series. Yike was definitely the better jungler, and that was very noticeable. When Razork loses, Fnatic struggles to be able to generate tempo. I don't know how many times I need to say that, but it really is kind of the case with this team. Humanoid was fine basically outside of this Game 4. I think it was his worst game of the series. Trimby loses when Noah loses. Again, he's going to take a lot of risks. He's going to try and take a lot of these skirmishes in the mid game. If his team's not in a good position, it's going to be punished, and it's very similar to Razork in that way. And I think Wunder was probably the most consistent member of Fnatic across this series, but only so much you can do on the top side. It's going to be interesting to see if they end up signing him to a longer contract. I think it's up, or his contract is up before they go to Worlds. I don't know if he's going to be able to, you know, play. I don't know what the situation with Oscar is. I don't imagine that, you know, Oscar would have gotten the surgery now if he didn't think he was going to be back for Worlds, but Wunder is like the 6-man, the sub, if they need him, would probably be best case scenario for Fnatic, so it's going to be interesting to see what kind of direction they want to go in with that, but they are still going to Worlds. They're still going as the 2 seed. It's going to be a positive. Definitely some things they need to figure out if they want to compete internationally, but there is talent on this team, and there is an avenue for them to be able to take it, but I think G2 proved across this entire series that if you're looking for the team to watch coming out of the West in 2023 at the World Championships, it's once again the Kings of Europe. All right, but that is going to do it for my LEC Season Finals overview and analysis video. That's going to wrap up my domestic coverage for every league that we cover here on this channel in 2023. It's over. The only thing that is left to cover is Worlds, and I'm incredibly excited to say that we know our teams that are going to be going to Worlds from the LEC. Of course, G2, Fnatic, and Mad Lions qualifying for the World Championships, BDS qualifying for the Worlds Qualifying Series to face off against Golden Guardians to see who gets into the play-in stage. It's all going to be very exciting, but all that's going to be covered on this channel. Do not worry if you're looking for League of Legends, LoL Esports coverage. This channel is the place for it. If you enjoyed a video like this, I promise you're going to enjoy a lot of the other content. We've covered all 4 of the major regions all year long. It's now time to put that work to good use and bring it all together. We're going to be doing a ton of World stuff by the end of this month and leading into October, leading into the World Championships. We're going to be doing a meta report. We're going to be going over all of the top players at the tournament. We're going to be going over all of the top teams, power ranking everybody, giving predictions, play-ins, main stage, you know, everything. It's going to be full coverage of the tournament. And so if you're interested in that, hit subscribe. I would really appreciate it. Those videos are going to be very insightful. I hope I've gathered a lot of information, and I'm going to be rewatching a lot of the playoffs from basically every region, not only the major ones, but the minor regions as well. And so you're not going to find a more comprehensive overview of what's going to be going on at the World Championships than this channel. Of course, if you did enjoy this video, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. It lets me know you guys are enjoying the content. And of course, it does help this video get out to more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. But with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day. And I will see you all